but I had to do it to challenge these forces,
You had to step into the church in the Soviet Union because that was a countercultural act, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, here we are once again on another edition of Things Hidden. And this is going to be a real fun one, folks, because this touches on a subject that I have talked about. But now we have a real scholar, a true person who has studied history. He's a professor of history. He's the author of the book, Socialism as a Secular Creed. We have with us Professor Andrei Znamenski. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Glad to be at your show, and I hope we are going to have a nice conversation about this most important topic that actually elevated itself to the center of our political debates, right?
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that's of interest to me because my background, I try to look at, politics from an anthropological perspective, which I think you share an interest in anthropology as well as a scholar, right?
Absolutely correct. In fact, I should tell you and your listeners that I started my career as a semi-anthropologist. I wanted to become an anthropologist. In fact, I wanted to study indigenous people, Native American, Native Americans, and indigenous Siberians. Okay. But in the Soviet Union, where I lived my young years, the first part of my life, I didn't have a chance to become an anthropologist because there were no anthropology departments. So in order to become an anthropologist, you had to be a historian. So that's how I became a historian. But actually, I fulfilled my dream. So I did become a kind of ethnic historian. That's how I define myself. And I did defend my first PhD back in Russia. It was on Native Americans, strange as it may sound. And then when I came here, 1991, I defended my second PhD. It was also on Native Americans in Alaska. I lived there. I went hunting with them, fishing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then, strange as it may sound, I became interested in links between indigenous people of North America and indigenous Siberians. And that's how, even though I left Russia, I became interested in Siberia. So I studied Siberian natives and I wrote a few books on this, on their religion. I leave them on...
Did you eat the whale meat?
Not yet, but I did eat moose meat. I ate a lot of deer meat. Salmon, I ate a lot of salmon, which
were they very carnivorous, right? A lot of meat consumption.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Lamb, I ate a lot of lamb in Siberia in early years of my career.
Did they do? Was that were they doing the? Did you hear any of the singing where they go? Oy, oy, oy,
yeah, this was that's where I did my research. By the way, before I shifted my interest to the socialism and what's going on in our life.
Mm-hmm.
My most recent book, before I wrote my socialism book, was about Inner Asia, and I did my research in Altai, where these guys have the throat singing like and the different tunes of this. So it's hard for like a Western ear to catch it, but they have a special musical instrument called tapshur with one string, so you can convey a bunch of emotions by playing this one string.
Wow, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, very cool. So I want to dive right into you're in the Soviet Union. What was the picture of primitive man, and what was the dominant theory of primitive man in Soviet Union academic circles at the time that you're a young man there?
See, as I said, I lived the first part of my life until 1991 in the Soviet Union, the second half of my life here in the United States. But Soviet Union was the country that had this ideology called Marxism-Leninism,
right,
which was a sort of secular religion,
right,
that was imposed on Russia in 1970. So it was basically an atheistic state where traditional Christianity was phased out and replaced by the secular religion, where you had to worship what? You had to worship science, but again, not science in our current sense of the word. We might talk more about it, but the science of Marxism. Okay, so they believed in the Soviet Union that Marxism that had been invented by Karl Marx and then perfected by Vladimir Lenin, the kind of the guy who founded the Soviet Union. So that was a hard science. Why? Because they believed that this social science could explain, like philosophical stone, everything in our world. They believed that humankind developed according to particular stages of evolution. See, our listeners, we need to understand that in the 19th century, when Marxism had been born, also great minds, enlightened minds, they thought in terms of evolution, Darwin's evolution, and they tried to extend this on our society.
Mm-hmm.
So it was assumed that Marx came up with the theory of society, how society developed. So the gist of his theory was very simple. So our society evolved from primitive communism, from tribal communism. So originally, Marx believed that society lived in the stage of primitive communism when everybody was equal. It was tribal society. It was good. Everybody was equal. But there was a historical flaw in this society. It was a bunch of poor people. There were not enough material forces, okay, to make them prosperous. So he said historically, it was necessary. Nobody knows how. He said natural forces of nature made society to develop into the next stage. He said it's a stage of slavery, when one part of society began to exploit another part of society. He said it was an unavoidable evil. Okay, so we have a group of people who enslave the others, and those others who had to work hard, they created material wealth. Okay. And at a certain point, this stage of society called slavery exhausted itself, and it gave rise to a next, more perfect stage of societal evolution called feudalism. Okay, mm-hmm. So it's when we have two new classes instead of slaves and slave holders. We have new classes naturally come into the picture: peasants and lords. So it was a much better way to exploit people. So more material wealth could be created. And that's how it was going on for like a few hundred years. And then Marx said this stage of society exhausted itself as well at some point. And it gave rise to a new form of society, more perfect, a new unavoidable evil called capitalism. Okay, when we have two new classes coming to replace the old ones, so-called proletarians, industrial working class, and bourgeoisie, capitalists. Okay, and capitalists exploited the industrial working class, but it could not last forever. Okay, at some point, these oppressed, they felt bad about it. They got together. How? He said forces of nature naturally forced them, because they worked together under the same roof on a factory, hundreds of people. They felt this brotherhood, sisterhood, and then naturally started to feel that they are oppressed. But a group of intellectuals called Communist Party, and explains to them that they needed to feel oppressed because some of them might not be aware of this. So that's how the role of the Communist Party becomes important. Okay, so the enlightened people, so socialist,
like a priesthood.
Exactly. It's a good way, priesthood. Like socialist missionaries come to them and explain to them, don't have your false consciousness. So the bourgeoisie tries to suppress you. It doesn't allow you to feel that you are oppressed. And eventually, driven by these socialist missionaries, this, like you said, priesthood, secular priesthood, workers, they rise up and they smash capitalist society. And what happens? According to Marx, that will be the last stage in the human development. Okay, it's like a final judgment.
Like apocalypse.
Apocalypse, exactly. It's a good way to put it. In fact, I strongly encourage you to interrupt me at some points, because I feel that you make this kind of linchpin counts. It's really important what you just said. Apocalyptic forces. Okay, so we have this grand battle, and he said actually it shouldn't be only one country where this grand battle takes place. It should be worldwide Holocaust, revolutionary Holocaust. A revolution could not win in one country. It could be a global Holocaust. So this uprooted people, industrial working class, revolts and smashes the bourgeoisie, confiscates the property, and sets up what? The dictatorship or proletariat. So this dictatorship exists to do what? To phase out the forces of the old world. It clears the ground, and together dragging other people who might be ignorant, the working class people, drags everybody into the golden paradisical future, paradise, called communism. See, that was the theory of evolution in a nutshell. That's what Marx essentially argued. And if you look carefully at what I just described, you see that it's a secular version of Judeo-Christian concept.
Right,
at first, we had paradise when people lived in this Eden, when Adam and Eve in this primitive communism. It was good, but it was poverty, like equality and poverty. But then he said, we have a few stages of unavoidable evil when society had to fall down. So you could not be redeemed before falling down. So humankind fell down into these oppressive stages, okay? And then these oppressive stages, they kind of negate themselves. At the last stage is capitalism. And that's when humankind steps into the society of future called communism. And that's when the eternal paradise comes,
And the
end
goal,
of history.
The goal is to end the state, but the state, the communist state is kind of like braces to correct the teeth of humanity until it's ready to have perfection, right?
Absolutely. Again, I appreciate that you interrupted me, because this interruption is very important, what you just mentioned. I almost lost my train of thought, but you drove me back. In fact,
like a good communist, the trains must run on time.
Exactly. Yeah, you acted right now as this enlightened priest, that navigated me in the right direction. But again, to put the jokes aside, basically what you made me emphasize is that when Marx came up with this theory, okay, that we need the dictatorship or proletariat, the big, strong state, before the state itself would be smashed and gives rise to this association of free producers. So he said some way in future, society would be gone. But before society would be gone, we need the strong dictatorship or proletariat, so strong state, to destroy the forces of exploitation, okay? And that's what became the major argument, the major debate between anarchistic socialism and Marxian socialism in the 19th century, when Marx came up with his concept of communism, okay, and Marxism. Because maybe you don't know, but some people who looked into history of anarchism maybe know about this, that in the second half of the 19th century, there were two most popular trends in socialism. It was anarchism and Marxian socialism. So Marxism and anarchism, two most popular trends, okay? And there were different also versions of anarchism, but one of the popular versions was represented by a French anarchist called Proudhon. His name was Proudhon. And he argued that he debated Marx, okay? He said, you're fighting against the state. You try to bring the state to eliminate the state. How come? He said, you will be actually trapped, because if you empower the state, it will last forever. And in this case, Proudhon was right, because when you give big teeth, fangs to the state, you empower the state. And that's what historically did happen, okay? But at that time, when Marx was alive, anarchists, they lost this battle. Why? Because it was not their time at that time, okay? Because at the end of the 19th century, we have these big forces, statist forces, okay, come into the picture. They were doomed to lose, anarchists, at that time, because there were not enough people to support them, okay? Because we have big empires, we have colonization, we have these big armies, we have the new battles, First World War coming to the picture, okay? So nobody wanted to listen to this Like they thought stupid guys who ask for self-government, autonomy, local self-determination. It didn't make sense, okay? So that's what I'm trying to argue. It's one of the arguments of my book is that, unfortunately, Marxian socialism, it was to win at some point. It became one of the most popular trends in socialism by the beginning of 1900s, okay? So some people don't know about it. It was unfortunately unavoidable, okay? Because we have a bunch of discontent people, working class people who work like 10, 11, 12 hours in the factories. And on the other hand, we have this bunch of secular missionaries, this new priesthood who come to them, journalists, reporters, scholars who say, hey guys, wake up. You're exploited, you're oppressed. So it was a natural movement, okay? That's my major argument, because some conservatives, they believe that communists or socialists, they come and hijack societies. Like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whom I respect and whose books I recommend people to read, like Gulag Archipelago. But at the same time, he had this wrong view, for instance, of the Bolshevik Revolution. He argued that Bolsheviks, essentially in 1917, they came from the West in a sealed train and imposed themselves on the innocent Mother Russia. No, it doesn't happen this way, okay? There is an old Russian saying, it goes like this, tell me who your priest is, and I will tell you who your parishioners are, It's basically each country deserves its own government, The governments or like ideologies, they don't come from nowhere, They are not imposed from nowhere, There is a fertile ground for them. If people are ignorant enough to accept particular ideology, what can you do? What can you do? Like, for instance, in 1949, in the United States, Harry Truman was blamed in losing China. That's how he lost his elections to Dwight Eisenhower. But unfortunately, a Communist Party in China in 1949 was extremely popular among these ignorant peasants who were caught into this trap of the simplified Marxian ideology, which Chairman Mao, this Chinese communist dictator, brought to them. And he said, hey, a bunch of landlords have this land. Let's confiscate it. I'm going to give you land. Of course, more than half of the country supported him. Okay, they kicked out all middle-class people along with these landlords, and that's how they ended up in Taiwan. But that's not the point. The point is that there was a lot, unfortunately, grassroots support for communism in China. The same in Russia, okay? Of course, later it was a rude awakening for them. The Chinese peasants realized that they were not allowed to own the land because Chinese communists forced them into collective farms and started to confiscate their produce, okay? Same thing had happened in Russia before, but it was later. So originally they were hooked on this popular Marxism. And that's what I want to emphasize, that when Marxism had been invented by Karl Marx and his friend Friedrich Engels and another friend, his name is, we don't know too much about him. And that's what I write about in my book, about this third guy, Moses Hess, okay? It started to spread around to other countries, like, for example, Christianity emerged in Europe, emerged in Middle East, Jerusalem, Palestine, and then spread to Europe, and then to other countries, Africa, Latin America, right? So in the same way, in the same manner, socialism, which originated in Europe, particularly in Germany, France, and England, started to spread around the world. Okay, it goes to Southern Europe, then it goes to Russia, then it spreads to China, then it spreads to Latin America, and a little bit to the United States, See, the problem with this was that at the end of the 19th century, a traditional Christianity experienced a huge crisis. A lot of so-called great minds, enlightened minds, they either became atheistic or they became frustrated about the mainstream churches, okay? And that's how socialism comes in as a form of surrogate secular religion, okay? It's a lot of people were hooked on this. And it became like a new church for some people, okay? In Southern European countries, it was more like a communistic movement, okay? Because communism is more hierarchical. In Northern Europe, it became democratic socialism or democratic socialism. Why? Because Northern Europe, it's a Protestant area, right? Where Protestant church is more popular. It's more decentralized,
right?
Because Martin Luther was fighting against papal hierarchy. So there was not much room for traditional communism to win, okay? So that is why communism became more popular in Southern Europe, countries like Italy, France, or in Russian Orthodox Russia, where everything was built by hierarchy. Okay, see, that's what I'm writing about. It's another point I'm trying to make in my book, that why in particular countries, particular cultures, specific forms of socialism became popular. Okay, for example, I'm sure you guys and girls ask yourself, why does socialism still enjoy so much popularity in China, right? Why? So I asked myself the same question, and I have an answer in my book to this question. And I ascribe it to what? To Confucian culture of traditional China, because Confucianism actually like a convenient glove for Marxism that had been introduced to China from Russia in the form of Marxism-Leninism. See, Marxism came to China from Russia, where it had been digested through Russian eyes, so it became more authoritarian. So when it traveled to China, it was already hierarchical. And when Confucian culture accepted it, it was perfect, because look, Confucianism, it's not an Abrahamic religion in traditional sense of this word, right?
Right.
There was no concept of God. So Confucianism, it's more like a moral philosophy, how to make this world around us better, how to upgrade human beings, how to make them into perfect human beings. In fact, when Confucius found, or Confucianism had been asked, do the gods exist? He said, I don't care about the other world. I am more concerned about this world. So we have this type of philosophy. And what Marxism comes from Russia, and they meet each other, it's perfect. It's a perfect fit. So that is why Marxian philosophy and socialism is still popular in China. It became part of their traditional spirituality, traditional ideology. Okay, it's very much still alive. Okay.
And besides that, though, there was still the element of Christian imitation in Marxism. How did the Chinese adopt that, though? I understand your point that it got a little bit more authoritarian through it passing through Russia and their digestive system. It comes out into China, and it's a little bit more authoritarian at that point. But still, there's an element, there's a kernel of Marxism which has that Christian, the first shall be last and the last shall be first vision.
Absolutely.
Why does China take it? Why does, you've got the authoritarian to sell it, but I still want to know why they so readily accept something which they did not have a familiarity with. The first shall be last and the last shall be first, or did they in the Confucian tradition? I don't know. Any thoughts?
See, a lot of thoughts, because on this point you are wrong, because in the middle of the 19th century in China, there was a first attempt to appropriate a Western ideology on a grand scale. And Marx, by the way, wrote about it. He became interested in this movement. Maybe not many of us who are listening to this podcast heard about so-called Taiping Rebellion. Mm-hmm. Taiping Rebellion, it was a multi-million rebellion. Millions of people in China rebelled against Manchu Empire, because at that time China, in the middle of the 19th century, was ruled by Manchu. It's a group of related people, Asiatic but linguistical alien, who hijacked China in the 1600s. Okay, they created dynasty which ruled China. Okay, so there was a big revolt which lasted for literally decades. Okay, And this revolt was headed by a man and a group of people who congregated around this man who declared himself a Chinese Jesus. Okay, he literally declared what you just said. The last would be the first. Okay, he listened to this sermons of Catholic priests who landed in China, in coastal cities. Okay, so Judeo-Christian culture started to trickle in China through travelers and particularly through missionaries. So by the word of mouth, it spread around China and southern coastal areas of China and spread around. So peasants, some city residents in coastal cities of China, they picked up this philosophy and decided to use this against the Manchu dynasty.
Okay.
So there was a famine at that time in the middle of the 19th century, famine, then cholera, epidemic of cholera. And millions of people revolted. And ideology, which was most popular among them, was this ideology of bastardized Christianity, okay, which was mixed with Confucianism. So these guys and girls who listened bits and pieces of Christian doctrine, okay, they spread this word that we had this guy, I don't want to mention his name because we'll forget anyway. So there was a guy who was a petty bureaucrat, failed bureaucrat, who declared himself a Chinese Jesus Christ, who said, so I'm going to make this Christian revolution. So they even advanced on Beijing. Okay, at some point they besieged Beijing. They took over half of China. And Karl Marx was watching this rebellion, and he said, hey, something was going to start, and he was very upset because he was happy, but at the same time he was upset a little bit because his theory was that everything should start in Europe, okay, because Europe was the most advanced place in the globe, right? Because capitalism
so it wasn't fitting his model, his scientific model.
Exactly. It was not exactly fitting his model. But he was ready to compromise, but he was very uncomfortable, so he wasn't sure. And here we need to mention another thing. He receives a letter from some Russian populist, socialist, Antifa type guys, who were running around wild. Yeah, in the 1870s, 1880s, they tried to attack Russian bureau. Yeah.
Were they coming from the anarchist strain, or were they influenced by him, those guys that sent him the letter?
More anarchists, more populist anarchists, but they were drifting toward Marx because they realized that the violent tactics, they tried to destroy Russian officials. They literally attacked them, okay?
Bombs.
Attacked them, yeah, all this stuff, yeah, really horrible stuff, They made an attempt on the Russian Tsar's life, So anyway, but the Russian police rounded them up and put them in prison in a nice exile area, Siberia. So they were allowed to go free hunting, everything. So it wasn't brutal Stalin gulag, Anyway, it's another topic. So anyway, they arrested these guys, and these guys realized that the attempt to instigate revolution in Russia by using this radical extremist tactics didn't work out. So their gamble was that they would provoke violence in Russia. They would turn upside down the whole country. And that's how peasants would revolt. So their gamble was that Russian peasants, driven by this crisis, which they would provoke when they eliminate the top of the pyramid. So they would go and support them. But the Russian peasants did not support them because the Russian peasants still believed in a glorious Tsar, And so they realized that something was wrong with the philosophy. And some of these extremists, they became interested in Karl Marx. Okay. And one of them, girl named Vera Zasulich. In fact, there's an interesting book about her called Girl Assassin, Vera Zasulich, she writes a letter to Karl Marx in 1883. And she asked him, I know about your theory. You're trying to argue that a country cannot have a socialist revolution before it's not ripe, before it develops a strong industrial society, strong industrial order with these industrial workers, with middle class, with bourgeoisie. And unfortunately, Russia is a backward country. 80% of people are peasants. But we want to fight for socialism. So what are we going to do? Are you going to give up on us? And Karl Marx, he literally was tormented by this. He wrote her 5 versions of his response, and he kind of threw it away, remade it. And eventually he said, I love you guys. He wrote back to her. There's a letter. Okay, you can find it. Karl Marx's letter to Vera Zasulich. And he literally says, I love you guys. You're fine. You know, fight against this Russian Tsar. He's evil guy. But you know what? You still have to wait, because Europe, the most industrial area, is still the hope of the humankind. But don't give up on the peasants. Why? Because peasants, they are not perfect. They're not proletarians, but they can be used as allies. They can join European working class, industrial working class, in this global fight against capitalism. Okay, so basically he said, if you take over power, you are doomed to fail, because you don't have industrial working class. But if you support us in Europe, so together we will win. Okay, and that's so our listeners might ask me, why do I tell you this? Because there's a point here.
Yeah.
So then Lenin comes, the chief of Russian Bolsheviks, 1917, and he said, hey guys, that's how we're going to make the socialist revolution.
Right.
We have only 1% of people who are industrial workers. Okay, according to Karl Marx, working class people, they are going to be saviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are redeemers, because we have to know that it's another Judeo-Christian element in the Marxian philosophy, that working class was viewed as the redeemer of the world. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
They replaced Christ or chosen people with this chosen people named industrial workers. And Lenin said, yes, of course, industrial working class, these are the chosen people. What, we don't have enough of them in Russia, but they are going to be supported by backward peasants.
Mm-hmm.
And when Bolsheviks come to power in Russia, everybody said, hey, it worked. And that's when China comes to the picture. So when in 1949, Chairman Mao says, hey, Lenin said the peasants could be allies, but he moved further, Mao Zedong. He said, we don't need actual industrial working class. We don't need these chosen people. Why? We can use peasants as surrogate proletariat. If peasants are headed by enlightened masters, these priesthood, secular priesthood called the Communist Party, everything will be fine. And that's how he gave new hope to the third world. And that's how we have a bunch of guys like Franz Fanon, Fidel Castro, Agustin Yanet, a bunch of third world people who said, hey, peasants could be the new class of people, could be the new chosen people. See? That's how it works.
So I guess I got 2 questions that come to mind.
Sure.
First.
Go ahead.
Why was Karl Marx allowed by the establishment to be a part of such inflammatory instigations around the globe? You know, why wasn't his communications intercepted? Why was, or maybe they were, of course, but why, how come these things, today you have, in a modern America, authorities are very, very monitoring of any kind of instigation, right, of destroying the power establishment. So why was Karl Marx given pretty much a lot of freedom
because
to do what he wants to do, to stir up trouble around the world?
There's an answer to this, because he chose the most tolerant country to live in, and the name of this country was Great Britain.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So originally he lived in Germany, but German government did not allow him to be there, to live in Germany. So he had to escape. Originally he escaped to France, because France was torn apart by a few revolutions, okay? And eventually he escapes to England, because England was the country that lived by the ideals of classical liberalism, okay? As long as he did not try to destroy the English government, okay, he verbally criticized things. So he worked in the British Library. In fact, since 1850s to the end of his life, he spent his time in England working in the British Library. So that's how it worked.
So did England, did the British government see him as a useful tool to undermine powers around the world that could be threats? Is that what they like?
No,
no, they didn't see it that way. Okay.
No, they didn't see it this way. They simply allowed him to be there because it was.
See, I was thinking maybe they thought of him like a Julian Assange, like we'll keep you around because you're good at stirring trouble for our enemy. Our
no, absolutely not.
Oh, okay.
Simply because England preached the freedom of speech, and remember Hyde Park, the famous Hyde Park, originated in England. It was a counter of freedom of speech. Okay, so it was he was allowed to speak freely. I wouldn't say that it was totally he was not harassed. There were he was under surveillance, but there was no attempt to crash him. Okay, there was no organized attempt on the part of the British police to squash him. Period. There was no such action. Okay, so he was allowed to act freely because England more and more turning into free country. Because we need to realize that originally there was no not many people had the right to vote in England, but by the end of the 19th century, more and more people were enfranchised in England. So England was rapidly becoming a free country. So by the beginning of 1900, you could preach basically any doctrine. So anarchists were there. Anarchists were there as long as they did not destroy anything. So they were allowed to be free, Lenin and his Bolsheviks, they had Congress, Communist Party Congress in England. The first free Congress of Bolsheviks was in England because their attempt to meet in Russia was squashed in 1898, but they were allowed by the British government to meet in 1903. They were under surveillance, but they were allowed to meet freely. So the same could be said about Karl Marx. See, that's the beauty of Great Britain at that time. I'm not sure about right now, what's going on there. Last time I was in England, in fact, in British Library, there was a conference there, 2017.
And didn't Trotsky have a penthouse on Fifth Avenue or something in New York City too? Was he pretty?
He lived briefly, yeah. He lived in United States because he escaped from the Russian Empire, and he lived there in U.S. until 1970.
And he had a driver,
but it was a very brief.
And I heard he had like a driver meet him whenever he needed. He was living a nice life, right? Yes,
yeah. Because I will tell you why. Because New York City, it's like socialist Jerusalem because it was saturated with socialist culture. Sometimes people on the right, they say, "Oh my goodness, he was so extremely showered with money. Where did this money come from?" The explanation is very simple because it was, is, and will be a socialist and left-friendly city. Because New York City accommodates hundreds and hundreds of left organizations which compete with each other. So it was very easy for him to do, we would say, to the crowdfunding. Mm-hmm. So there was a huge Eastern European immigration. It's Slavic immigration, Russian Jewish immigration. And these ethnic groups, these cultures were saturated with socialism, okay? It was like ethno-ideological culture that flourished there. So there were ethnic newspapers that published at that time in early 1900 in New York City. Mm-hmm. And 90% of them preached socialism, different versions of socialism. So he fit New York culture, it was not a problem for him to raise money in New York City. Mm-hmm.
So do you reject Anthony Sutton's ideas on this about the Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, or is there some connection there?
Oh, I reject it. And mm-hmm. Again, I don't want to, I might offend somebody, but
that's
see,
fine.
That's the problem with some conspiracy people, because you look, again, I respect any kind of idea, even I try to respect even those people who say that the earth is flat,
Right.
But that's the property, unfortunately, of a human mind, that we try to find one explanation.
Right.
Like a Marxist, an average Marxist believes, for example, that all evil and everything is, whatever evil happens in our world, it's because a bunch of financiers, capitalists hijacked the world.
Right.
They screwed up. Okay,
Right.
National Socialists might say, oh, it's all Jews. Okay, as some modern day conspiracy theorists might say, oh, it's a Freemasons, they screwed up the world. Or a present day Russians, some Russians, if you go to Russia, you know, and some people believe that the CIA, State Department, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, these three forces, they screwed up the Soviet Union, they plotted and destroyed the glorious Soviet Union. That's how this empire was gone, you know. So the UFO people, or what you just mentioned, there's a theory that Wall Street purposely perpetrated this conspiracy, planting Trotsky. I'm sorry, I'm a historian, you know, and I see these big forces in play. You cannot reduce.
Right.
And that's what us human beings, we don't want to accept that the world, it's a bunch of different forces.
Yeah.
Colliding with each other.
I'm not saying that to accept his model, but was there any evidence that Wall Street was involved with developing the some of the industrial factories in the Soviet Union? Not to say that was the primary fuel for the ideology. Okay, I agree with you that the primary fuel for the ideology was the local appetites that were already hungering for this kind of.
We misunderstand each other. I'm sorry. I beg your pardon.
Right.
Because what you just mentioned is that when Bolsheviks, the Russian communists, took over power, that Wall Street came to help them build socialism, right?
Right.
That's true. And that's
what I'm getting at.
That's it. Because there's no way, because the facts are there. And in fact, Lenin, the chief of Russian Bolsheviks, he said, he literally said it in 1921, I think. He said, these Western capitalists, they're so stupid, they will sell us the rope which we're going to use to hang them. Okay, That's what he said. It's a profit motive because Bolsheviks, and as a historian, I will explain to you why it happened. So in this case, yes, of course, it did happen. Because when Soviets came and took over Russia, Russia was a very backward country, peasant country. There was not much industry. So they needed to build up quickly this industry. What did they do? They decided to hijack the countryside. They decided to uproot the countryside, to force all peasants to live on collective farms. Okay, they were forced to live in collective farms, and their grain was confiscated. So why? They wanted to sell this grain to the Western countries. To do what? To get the hard currency. To do what? To hire Western companies, Western engineers, to literally buy entire factories, dismantle factories in US and bring them to Russia to build this foundation of socialism. And of course, especially during the Great Depression, they had a bunch of people in the West who flooded to Russia, who said, hey, my goodness, they pay us in gold. So that's how we have a few Ford plants literally dismantled and assembled in Russia. Okay, we have thousands of engineers coming to Soviet Russia to build the socialism there, to factories, industrial facilities. But the money to pay them come from the peasants. Okay, 7 million peasants literally were killed, starved to death, in order for the Soviet industry to build up. Okay, so that's how it happened. Again, as
sacrifice.
A sacrifice.
It's okay because this is a religious movement, and you have to sacrifice some for the greater good, right?
Absolutely right. Again, I appreciate. So that's exactly the time when you needed to interrupt me, because now we are going to mention something very important, which we discuss on YouTube clips and everywhere. Okay, means and ends. Okay, goals and means. So exactly right. That was the dominant philosophy among Soviet communists at that time, and among Western progressives at that time. That Stalin, Lenin, and his successor Stalin, they were building something good, something progressive. Yes, Stalin, helter-skelter guy, 7 million people, not exactly a good thing, but the glorious future requires this. The noble goal, guys. Okay, and that's how we have all these journalist reporters like Walter Durante, New York Times reporter, who comes and says, that's wonderful. These backward peasants, it's a collateral damage. They have to go. They have to go. That sometimes people wonder why we have so many useful idiots. Thousands of people literally worshipped Stalin and Soviet socialism. They went to Russia and kept repeating this phrase, like what's his name, Lincoln Stephens. Remember, he went, an American reporter, he went to Russia and he said,
right.
I saw the future and it works. Okay, it's a famous, often quoted phrase. So there were thousands of people coming, like Quakers, progressives, like what's Rex Stagwell, one of the guys who belonged to the New Deal, FDR New Deal. He also went to Russia and he said, oh my God, they're going to collectivize Russian agriculture. I wish we had the same thing. They are not going to have fences. Everything would be without fences. I feel so bad about American countryside because it's divided by fences, not good. But in Stalin's Russia, we have plain field over horizon. There are no fences because the yield, the grain yield would be so glorious. Millions, tons of millions of grain. We need something like this. So that's the catch. These useful idiots who worshipped Soviet Union in 1930s, they were not exactly bad people. Sometimes we think that, oh, they're malevolent people, that's vicious people who worship this dictator. Not exactly, They thought, unfortunately, that the future was so good. The future, it was about the big state. The future, it's about this collectivism. The future, it's about national economy controlled by the government, okay? And everything that brings us to this future is good. That is why these backward peasants, they have to go. They're like some kind of Native Americans. They have to go. See, because the progressivism believed at that time in this way. These are survivals of the past, okay? That is why Walter Durante said, it's no big deal, 7 million. Yes, of course, they died, but it's unavoidable sacrifice. What can you do? See, that's
and it's what this is a fusion between paganism and Christianity and Judeo-Christianity, because you have Judeo-Christianity introducing this concept of a linear view of history, that we're moving towards something, whereas the pagan view was more of a cyclical pattern, circular, eternal return, like Nietzsche referred to it as, and this idea that in the pagan culture, you must sacrifice for the greater good. Christianity renounces that and says, no, don't sacrifice your neighbor, self-sacrifice your right to sacrifice your neighbor, the way Jesus did when he had the opportunity to reciprocate oppression with violence himself. Remember, he was offered the opportunity to be a political leader who would storm the castle of oppression in his own world and institute justice by force, but he renounces that. He sacrifices that right to sacrifice, and therefore he opens up this non-violent way of changing
exactly. Sorry, now I have to interrupt. You remember this? I don't remember, of course, the exact quotation, but he said something that I'm not talking about kingdom on this earth. I'm talking about the heavenly kingdom.
Right. Yeah.
That's what he said. Yeah.
Right. So what I'm saying is that when I hear the language of Marxist dreams of Stalin, that he can sacrifice some for the glorious future we're making on earth, it is a fusion of pagan sacrifice to achieve catharsis, to achieve unity and order, with a Christian imagination added on, where we're going somewhere. We're building a city. We're building a future perfection in history, because history is moving towards the kingdom of heaven on earth. So you see the fusion of these two things together there, and a kind of wrapping of science, the garment of science, right? Yeah.
Excellent. By the way, let me capitalize on your last remarks. Okay. See, we may wonder why this prophecy became so popular, right? Why essentially like you said, this paganism mixed with secularized traits of Judeo-Christian tradition, why it became such an explosive prophecy that hijacked the minds of millions of people. Because of your last remark, because it was linked to science.
Right.
Because people with elementary education by the end of 19th century, and of course intellectuals, they started to worship science. Science for them was everything. It's like something that could replace religion, especially when people had to live through industrial revolution, because they said, oh my goodness, so many miraculous inventions, like Thomas Edison inventing like this electricity, okay, before James Watt had come up with the steam engine, a railroad steam engine.
Right.
So science can perform miracles. So in this, God is dead, science could replace God. Okay. In fact, there was a guy whose books Marx extensively used. His name was Auguste Comte. Auguste Comte, who was considered the founder of sociology. He, in fact, suggested that we need religion of science. He, in fact, decided to replace Catholicism in France with the scientific religion, to worship human beings. And he replaced the days of saints, the feast days for saints, he replaced with the feast days of scientists, like the day of Isaac Newton, the day of Galileo Galilei. So he introduced scientific worship, scientific prayers. Yes,
and that happened in the French Revolution as well, where they tried
religion of reason. Yeah, exactly. The cult of reason. There was a goddess of reason. In fact, they used like a model was used, like a French Parisian prostitute. That she was used as a model, a local sculpture used her to erect this figure that embodied this goddess of wisdom. So in one hand, I don't remember exactly how she looked, but in one hand holding a book, and another some kind of mathematical device.
So why do you think that Russian and Chinese peasants took to Marxism more than the Western industrial countries? Because that's what Marx wanted it to come from, the Western industrial proletariats, but it seems like it mostly caught the most fervent fire and the peasants of Russia and China, which again, like you said, doesn't fit his model. So why did the peasants get into this more? Or, what happened? What do you think was the thing there?
Because Marxism was customized to the Russian and Chinese soil and then to the African soil. That is why we have a bunch of countries in the 20th century.
Why didn't they customize it for the West better, at the time? How come we couldn't figure out how to tweak it for them?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Because
was it because Christianity was more Protestant, more decentralized or something? Or is that a factor?
That's what we remember before our interview. We mentioned this because in many European countries, communism, this radical Marxism, could not find a fertile ground, because Sweden, Northern Germany, England, especially England, Denmark, Netherlands, and the United States, for that matter, Canada as an extension of European culture, they were more congregationalist societies that preached local autonomy, local self-government, by the way, something interesting, talking about traditionalism, see, that is why it's another interesting topic. What is exactly Western traditionalism,
Right.
So Western traditionalism, it's something that was based on local self-government, culture of congregation, so local elections, when people elect their own minister, when they create these parish schools, unlike cultures, hierarchical cultures like Italy, partially Austria, Greece, France,
and also
Spain, China, Russia,
and South America, where the Catholic Church,
South America, Catholic Church, because
they accept Marxism more than America has.
Oh my God! It's my of the worst regrets is that my book became so big, the Socialism as a Secular Creed. It's almost 500 pages. I didn't have enough room to write about Latin America,
right?
Because it's a huge chunk. Because Latin America, a Catholic era became extremely like a fertile ground to embrace radical socialism, Marxian socialism. Why? Guys, look what's going on here. Because Catholic Church, look, the shell was created by the Roman Pope. So it's a Roman Pope on the top of the pyramid. I simplify, of course, the whole story. And the people essentially, historically, were encouraged to listen to what the Roman Pope had to say, right? To what the priest had to say. The Bible reading historically was not too much encouraged in the Catholic tradition, unlike the Protestant tradition.
That's right. And that's the key issue right there. Because
exactly.
Go ahead, go with it.
Yeah. But the Protestants were more people of the book, because Martin Luther said, read the Bible like crazy. Everybody started to read like crazy. It's a culture of reading in Northern Europe. But in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe, where the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox Church, okay, in Greek Orthodox Church, people were obligated to listen to the state. State was the great patron of the church in the Greek Orthodox Church. In Western Europe, in Catholic countries, it was the Roman Pope that was the number one person to go to. Okay, and by the end of the 19th century, when we have these secular minds coming to the picture, science that eroded Catholic Church, in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, secular culture phased out much of traditional church. So what came to replace? Marxian socialism in many ways came to replace it. And when you have a communist international, third international, created by Bolsheviks in Moscow. Again, in Moscow, Stalin was viewed as the new communist pope. And everybody had to go to Moscow because Moscow was viewed as the third Rome already, historically. That's where all radical socialists had to go in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. Before the Soviets lost their face when Khrushchev denounced the cult of Stalin in 1956. Moscow was the Rome where radical socialists had to go to listen how to build socialism. Okay, that was the secular structure that came to replace the Catholic Church.
That's why I think it's very important to emphasize not just the hierarchical structure of the church, making it a more fertile ground for Marxism to fertilize, to come into a culture, but also the access to the text is very important, because when you engage the text rather than hearing it through the mediation of the institution, the text is what springs out this concept more often of opening up the way for self-governance, opening up the way to be more skeptical of oppressive structures. And so when you hide the text and you kind of lock the text away in a language that many folks wouldn't even understand sometimes, I think what happens is you allow for more authoritarian ideologies to spring forth.
Can I add something to this? Because look, it's another important remark you just made, because in Catholic countries, in Orthodox countries, they encourage this, I would say, the kind of Talmudic approach to communism, where the catechist type Marxist works, writings were published, and they were enforced on society, okay, in the form of catechism. In Northern Europe, where communist parties, communistic or Marxian socialism eventually didn't find too much room, traditionally the people compared and contrast text, okay? A lot of people originally could read the Bible, right? And where you have a bunch of people reading the Bible and the works by Martin Luther, John Calvin, what do you have? You naturally have a bunch of critical minds questioning things, right? If you have a Bible group, for instance, meeting each other, you have 5 people coming to do a Bible group. You have a bunch of people who debate each other, right?
That's right, yeah.
The same thing happened when they started to read Marxian works in Northern Europe. They started to debate each other. So how could they accept the Communist International with Bolsheviks in charge, when you have a bunch of critical minds? So that is why communism could not find too much room in Northern Europe.
That's right.
That is why in Northern Europe we have social democracy coming to the picture. It's so-called reformed socialism, like Swedish model, English Fabians. You heard about English Fabians?
Yeah, the Fabian Society,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Fabian Society, labor rights, Labor Party, Social Democratic Party in Netherlands. So more reform, not so helter-skelter.
trying to work with capitalism, but
exactly
make it better.
Exactly,
right.
Trying to use capitalism, and that is why these reformed socialist parties, they rejected communists. Okay,
right.
That's how later we have two new factions in socialism, and that's what I'm writing about in my book. Another thing, see, in the 19th century it was anarchism and Marx and socialism, but in the 20th century we have two new factions in socialism dividing this creed, socialist creed. It's a social democracy in Northern Europe and partially in the United States, because part of the Democratic Party, they embrace this ethos, without talking about socialism, because the word socialism until recently was not yet popular in the United States,
Right.
But in Europe, we have a bunch of social democratic parties, like the German Social Democratic Party, Swedish Social Democratic Party, which originated from Marxian socialism, but they reformed themselves because of this bunch of critical minds who read the texts and who were critical. On the other hand, we have the second faction, communism, and that's how they started to attack each other. So we have social democracy, big faction in socialism, and we have communism. And throughout the 20th century, we have this big fight between communism and social democracy. And another conclusion I'm trying to draw in my book is that in 1991, when communism failed in the Soviet Union, on its own collapsed, okay, what the winner was social democracy, okay, which raises a lot of questions, okay? So definitely social democracy is better than communism, but now we have to look into what social democracy, what democratic socialism is all about. Okay?
Right. That's
it's
the interesting thing. Because
thing.
I had Slavoj Žižek on my show,
You did?
Yes. And,
oh my God.
Yeah. One of the things I remember when he debated Jordan Peterson, the psychologist from Canada, he said in that debate, he said, you've got to stop talking about cultural Marxism. The political correctness that you're critiquing has nothing to do with Marxism. Do you agree with that? Or is that?
Yes and no, because Zizek was right on the one hand. Why? Because the mainstream socialism today, it's not exactly Marxian socialism as it had existed in the 19th century. It's the same thing like Christianity, which we have right now somewhere in Denver, or I don't know, somewhere even in the South. It's not Baptist church as it had existed in the American South in the 19th century. It's a different Catholic church today in Rome. It's a different Catholic church.
Right.
Same thing about socialism. Okay, but at the same time, the roots of this Catholic church, which exists today, they are located in the medieval times, right? Even pre-medieval times, the same thing. So in this case, Zizek is wrong, on the other hand, because what we have today, democratic socialism, reform socialism, or the cultural left, we call it cultural left, it definitely originated from classical Marxian socialism, okay? Even though there were some non-Marxian traits in socialism, which was either shut down or marginalized in the last century. But 80% of current socialism, it did originate from Marxian socialism. And how it happened gradually, not overnight, okay? And that's another interesting thing. I became fascinated with this. How did this transition happen? So as a historian, I became interested in examining this, how precisely this change happened. See, this classical Marxism in the West were class-based, that was tied to industrial working class, because industrial working class in classical Marxism was viewed as the ultimate noble savage, as the savior, redeemer, the chosen people that would save the world from oppression, okay? But what happened in this classical working class by 1960s, 1970s, classical, industrial, working class was almost gone because of manufacturing, change in manufacturing, the service industry, okay, phased out the traditional working class. We hardly had any masculine type guys left in Britain, in France, in Germany by 1970s, who handled heavy metals, like working on machines, you know. Why? Because half of the manufacturing moved to the third world, okay? Plus, service industry came to replace it. Plus, close to 1990s and 2000, we have robots coming to industry, okay? So there was no Marxian working class left. And there was a problem for the left. Who is going to save the world? Because, see, the shell, the niche had been created. The Marxian socialism had existed. The culture had existed. The intellectual resources. People invested in universities a lot of intellectual energy, resources in developing this intellectual subculture. Okay, so what's going on? So they started shopping around the world. Who is going to be the chosen people? And that's how the peasants come to the picture. They started looking at the third world. They said, oh my God, there's working class people in Western countries. They betray the cause of socialism.
Yeah.
They live a nice life, like Marcuse said, those rotten working class, they betray the socialist cause. These rotten people, how dare they are? They live a good life. They have 2 cars, they have a nice house. Damn them, you know, get out, you know, you spoil the feast. So that is why some of them go to the third world. They begin looking at China. Oh my God, in China, cultural revolution. Look, peasants, Chinese peasants, they knew great hope. They started looking into Africa. Oh, something is going on, national liberation movement. Maybe the major revolutionary center now shifted from the West to the third world, okay? So that's how they try to engage the third world. And that's how we have this worship of non-Western societies, non-Western cultures. It was nicely layered on the traditional Western habit of worshiping so-called noble savage, non-Western cultures, because it was all the Western tradition to worship non-Western cultures, to go to the Oriental countries, India, China, to get the wisdom, you know, because Western societies are so rotten, so nasty, you know. How dare they? They have a good standard of life, you know, plentiful societies. It's not good, you know. They destroy everything. So we enjoy, we have this nostalgia for mud, you know. We're going to Latin America, we will try ayahuasca, we will go to jungles, or we will go to Hindu yogas, we're going to apprentice with Siberian shamans. Okay, that's good. So see, that was the recurrent culture in Western societies. And that's how among the new left, which emerged in 1960s, 1970s, there was this new conviction that the wisdom is not in the West. The socialist wisdom was not anymore in the West. The socialist wisdom should be located in the East or in non-Western societies, okay? And that's how they started also looking for some traits of non-Western cultures within United States, within some European societies, like who could be the manifestation of these cultures? Muslim immigrants. Okay, that could be a new great hope, because some of them hate Western civilization, especially when some Islamic fundamentalists, they revolt against Western culture. And by the way, in 1977, a Trotskyite organization, I forgot exact name, it's, I think, International Socialist Party, they endorsed Islamic fundamentalists, the Great New Hope, as a new ally, that since they were enemies of Western society, Western culture, they could be embraced as the new Great Hope, since we don't have any revolutionary classes in Great Britain. And the same thing happened in the United States when Thomas Hayden, one of the leaders of New Left, he said, I give up on the Western working class. Okay, so we need to embrace the third world. There was another guy named Wright Mills, a sociologist, US sociologist, who came up with this definition of Victorian Marxism. He even wrote a letter in 1961, if I'm not mistaken. he sent a letter to the European left, and he said, you guys are still preaching Victorian Marxism with this industrial working class. Get out, get rid of this, because now we need to find new classes. The traditional working class does not exist. Okay. So for this guy, Wright Mills, he said, for me, the new class is intellectual. See, they're shopping around. So some people said, majority of people said it would be the third world, but this particular guy, he said, it should be intellectuals, okay, because they're smart. Yeah. In this case, he followed Antonio Gramsci, this Italian Marxist philosopher, who said, this enlightened Marxist intellectuals, they would be the navigators, great navigators, okay? But of course, it did not work well with the majority of leftists. Why? Because it sounded too elitist when you give power to intellectuals. That is why the third world line was predominant. And to the present day is the dominant line of thought in left intellectual life, that the third world is the great new hope. Okay, but they also tried to look for societies within the West who could be also great new hope, and that's how they, in addition to Muslim immigrants in Western Europe, they identified in North America indigenous societies, okay, like Native Americans. Who else could be? African Americans, since they also fit this category. So they are the new great hope. There's another great hope.
And that ties back into their interest in returning to African folk religion that you see now emerging.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The BLM organization leaders like to celebrate African folk religion as a renunciation of the Christian pollution into their culture, right? In their origin.
Yeah, the perception is very kind of simple and very natural, because since Western culture is rotten, evil, so where could we find our wisdom? The wisdom among these marginalized people. Okay.
Right.
As soon as they declared marginalized victims, of course, they acquire this status of, I'm sorry to say, no, quote unquote, noble savages, which perfectly fits this tradition. It's a profoundly Western tradition, by the way. That's what
it's a very ethnocentric Western.
It's a very ethnocentric, exactly.
It's
right.
Culturally chauvinistic to the core, because you're creating a Western definition that all other people have to operate under as a kind of, as if they are your objects of ownership.
Yes, in fact, I would like to draw attention to, there's a nice book, it was published a long time ago, called, as an example, I will give you, Marxism and Native Americans, published by a guy. It's a collection of works published by one Ward Churchill. It's the one who aroused this controversy after September 11. Remember who kind of Ward Churchill, who was self-declared Native American leader, although he was essentially kind of a Caucasian activist who declared himself a Native American. There was a lot of controversy around him. But anyway, he released this book. There was a debate between two groups, which highlights what I'm talking about right now. A debate between a revolutionary Communist Party. It's a Maoist Marxist organization, okay, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, this cultural left, like Ward Churchill and others, who say that, oh, we don't need you guys with your Western proletariat, okay, because Native Americans were already socialists traditionally. Before Marx started to preach his stuff, we already were socialists, okay? That's what acquired popularity right now for many groups of the left, okay? This cultural vision that since traditional working class does not exist anymore, or betrayed the cause, so now the great new hope could be found among these quote unquote noble savages, like indigenous societies, okay, marginalized societies.
And that dovetails with, the newly elected President Joe Biden. In his Oval Office, they said that he put in, like a bust of folks like Cesar Chavez, So Cesar Chavez is a labor activist, right? And he represents another faction in this new emerging search for the new chosen people, as you call them, right? This coalition of chosen people, of victims.
Exactly. But here's another problem, because much of this left, cultural left, they entered the mainstream. Okay. At the same time, many among the marginalized traditional left, they feel upset about it. Okay. So we should not, sometimes people who try to criticize the left, they view the left as like a homogeneous force. Okay. We shouldn't do it, because there are a lot of groups there, And for instance, right now, there is a big debate among a marginalized traditional Marxian left.
Right.
Who still believe in this working class, okay, which goes against the mainstream,
right?
On the one hand,
and the Republican Party is now taking on the populist workers, right?
Exactly.
By the way, say we don't need them. We don't need them.
That's the irony of the situation, because so-called traditional working class, they all vote for Republicans. Right?
So is the Republican Party going to look like the politics of Zizek pretty soon?
See, that's it. It's as again geopolitics and the political life. It's creates the strange kind of fellow travelers, So
yeah, they call it the dirtbag left, where they're politically incorrect. They're not so big on the cultural identity politics. Mm-hmm. They don't like that, but they do like the Marxist, classical Marxist concern for the worker, right? And you see that's kind of popular on the internet culture of the left right now. I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, one of the, again, examples of this debate between the cultural left, mainstream left, and traditional Marxian socialist is this debate about Project 1619. Okay. When Trotskyites, this socialist workers' party, they engaged people who authored the Project 1619 in debates. So if you Google this, you will see there's a debate, strong debate. Okay, they invited the Trotskyites, this traditional socialists, traditional Marxian socialists. They invited people who sided with the Project 1917 for debates, and there are two arguments go like this. Like those guys and girls who side with 1619, they said, everything is U.S. history is based on slavery. So racism is the anchor that had created the American culture, American society. That was the inherent evil that was
the original sin. Yeah,
original sin. Again, we're using the Christian language, but these Trotskyites, traditional Marxists, said, "Hey, it's not correct, because look, we have a bunch of other classes of people, different races, ethnic groups who had been similarly exploited. We had indentured servants, we had slaves from other cultures. We have, for goodness sake, we have some examples of mixed blood slaveholders who had black and Native American slaves, because slavery had been widespread in all cultures, okay? We had some Native American societies which also had slaves, like take Cherokee Indians, which was a slave-holding society. Maybe not many of you know that during the Trail of Tears, some of these Cherokees that were expelled by Andrew Jackson from the East, they were marching to Oklahoma carrying slaves on the wagons, which is kind of profound, I guess, irony of this. So they were oppressed, but at the same time, they themselves oppressed the other people. Okay, but anyway, so the picture was not so black and white. That's what Trotskyites tried to argue, this traditional socialists. They said, look, the society is, yes, we agree with this profound view that there were rich people who oppressed the poor people, but we should be looking at our life in a more complex way. Like our history, our society, 16 shades of gray. It's not so black and white. So there is a big debate right now within the left community. So it's interesting to watch. I feel like an anthropologist sometimes.
Yeah.
I put myself, I distance myself and I watch, because I'm like I can use this word, a scientist, I wouldn't say a scholar, like a scientist, I kind of put myself aside, and watch what's going on. It's interesting because.
So where do you see it going? I mean, I know you're a historian, not a forecaster, but I mean, you can see the trends of history. You see where this is going. I mean, what do you think is going to happen here? I mean, this is the most interesting time we've had, in some time in the West. Everything seems like it's up for grabs, but everything's up in the air right now, where
we definitely
parties are realigning and nobody knows what the future of these ideologies is going to look like because it's rapidly escalating and changing every year. So,
Absolutely. In fact, we live through definitely we live through a period of a new wave of socialism, popularity of socialism, not only in the United States, but in some other countries. But the problem here is that, and that's what how debate is going on the left, what kind of socialism it would be, because there are forces on the left that try to push toward traditional statist socialism, that it should be about mobilizing the great big father who comes and saves us all, distribute the wealth, okay? But there's another popular trend on the left. I would call it a libertarian trend. They said, oh, no, it's about actually people, empowering people on the ground, okay? So we might have different communities. What if we have one particular group of people, they want to live in this way, other group of people want to live in this way. Shall we come and impose on them one particular model, okay? So that is why there is a powerful trend, a libertarian trend, I would say. So we don't know where it would go, okay? On the one hand, we have definitely this powerful statist mobilization scheme that is growing on the left, okay? When a bunch of people, millions of people embrace this trend, because it's very convenient to have some kind of force, this again, the great father, the great like socialist quote unquote father that comes and saves us, But on the other hand, especially in the United States, we have a powerful, I would say, libertarian tradition that goes against it, that asks a natural question. So who is going to tell you that would be the right way? So maybe there are different versions of socialism. Who are you to tell me that your socialist scheme is the right scheme? Okay, that's a natural question. So it opens a Pandora's box of debates. And I have this hope that on the left, there would be at some point, and I see this trend that a lot of people, they would be asking a natural question. So who are you to tell me what to do?
Right.
It's a natural, but on the one hand, we should not neglect this spontaneous rise of socialist forces. Why? Because they always come up and become popular in a time of social crisis, okay, like financial crisis, 2008, when a bunch of people lost their savings, right? Of course. There's no I cannot deny that that's the time for socialists to come up. Or for instance, if we have, I don't know how many, like 20 million students owing money, right? They're in debt. Of course, they're going to vote for Bernie Sanders, because something should be done with this. Yeah, something should be done with this. It's a problem. It's a social issue. Don't you agree with me?
Right. Yeah. No, I think that the socialist answer of using force is a lot more attractive than libertarian answers that say, hey, well, because a libertarian might say, of course, government intervention is what got everyone in debt in college to begin with exorbitant costs of college. They would say, allow the students to discharge the debt in bankruptcy, which just isn't quite as attractive to say, hey, let's allow student loans to be discharged through bankruptcy to say, Uncle Bernie will take care of it. He'll just wipe it clean. There's something Jubilee about that, right? That Jubilee spirit of, well, you mean to tell me I don't have to have the stigma of bankruptcy plus I get free clear of my payments? That's a Jubilee spirit, again, that comes from the biblical tradition. I keep telling people we are swimming in the fishbowl of Judeo-Christianity, even as we reject the metaphysics.
Exactly.
We reject the metaphysics. But we are thoroughly within the aesthetic and ethical framework of the Judeo-Christian conversation. And And that's why, when people say, hey, the woke left, they look like a religion. That's precisely because the state is failing to unify people that the religious origins of its mechanism starts to be more transparently seen, you see. Now we can see the religiosity because we're not united on the binding institutions. We used to go to the American football game and we would be united about the American flag, the symbol of unity. And now it's a point of division. We can't even stand united on the symbol of America. So all of our institutions that kind of bound us together are now starting to fall apart. And as they fall apart, the religiosity of, well, hey, the Trump people, they're a cult. They worship Donald Trump. Or, hey, the woke left, they worship identity politics as this extremely strict, politically correct speech codes of canceling people who violate their rituals. We're seeing the religious origins of these ideologies come to the surface because the unity of the state and its institutions is falling apart.
Yeah, of course. And you mentioned the whole phenomenon of the cancel culture. It's also profoundly, in this case, it's driven by this notions, okay? Not only traditional, like socialist notions. It's we already had this, like, remember iconoclasts during the Reformation,
right? Yeah,
that tried to destroy like Catholic statues of saints. They toppled them down. This people who supported John Calvin and Martin Luther, they actually stormed into the churches and tried to destroy like Catholic paraphernalia. And the Catholics responded in the same way. They tried to burn Protestant books. They declared the Martin Luther and John Calvin's books as some kind of heretical. That, remember this, the Roman Pope issued index of forbidden books, books that had to be burned, right? So we already went through this. It had happened in our history. See, but the problem is that, do we need this type of behavior in the 21st century? Right now, I think the problem for us is how to find this middle ground in order for our local communities to find a middle ground, okay? If we don't find the middle ground, we will just eat ourselves. We will simply destroy ourselves because each side would feel that, oh, we are righteous, Okay, yeah. I will give you an example. Like, let's distance ourselves from the United States because some people might feel it's a very explosive topic. So I will give you an example. In the UK, for instance, Scotland and Britain, they debate about Scottish autonomy, Scottish self-government, okay? In Ukraine, they also had Eastern Ukraine populated by Russians and Central Western Ukraine, more Ukrainians, have this sense of identity. And the two areas debate each other, okay? In one case, we have UK, where Scottish people insist on strong autonomy. So you guys should let us have a strong autonomy. So how was this issue handled in UK? Nobody probably heard about how it was handled. Why? Because it hardly made any news, because in Scotland, there was a referendum about the amount of Scottish autonomy and whether Scotland should stay in Britain after Brexit. Majority of Scottish people chose that we should stay with Britain. So hardly anybody heard about it. We never heard about any people who were beaten, canceled, destroyed about it. So we never heard about statues being toppled down, statues of Winston Churchill toppled down about it. But if we go to Ukraine, 2014, when two areas like Eastern Ukraine wanted to join Russia, to secede, and the rest of Ukraine hated them for this, there was a civil war. There was a war when, in fact, Russia invaded Eastern Ukraine and helped these separatists in Eastern Ukraine, sent tanks, provoked the war. So 10,000 people died, and Ukraine had to send her troops to fight back against separatists and against the Russian army. So people were killing each other, destroying each other. They destroyed symbols of each other. In Ukraine, there was the whole campaign to topple down statues of Lenin, the chief of Bolshevik, because in the eyes of Ukrainians, the statues of Lenin symbolize the Russian imperialism, that counter that helped these Eastern separatists, Russian-speaking separatists. Thousands of statues were toppled down in Ukraine with no debates. There were no local referendum about these statues. Just mobs of people toppled them down, these communist statues. And when I was watching this, I kind of I was puzzled, because you cannot blame me in being in love with Lenin and communism. But at the same time, I kind of looked at this and I thought, I guess there should be some local referendum if a township or like local municipality decided to do something with the local symbols, historical symbols. At least a minimum requirement, they need to do a referendum, right? To ask local people whether they need it, right, or not, right?
But that is
nobody does this, That's what puzzles me. But it's the first step toward this self-government autonomy. That's how we learn self-government and the self-respect and mutual respect. Yeah, like for instance, Switzerland. Sorry, I'm distracting you a little bit. Like last week, I read on the news that in Netherlands, government imposed nationwide lockdowns. And 2,000 people revolted against this. People were beaten over this. A bunch of people were arrested. But in Switzerland, a European country, government said, hey, guys, in your local provinces and your local municipalities, you have to go by your referendum. You need to have a referendum. You have to decide in local areas to wear masks or not, to do lockdowns or not. So you guys know better, Right. We never heard about anybody being beaten in Switzerland. I'm sorry to say, and that's the questions that come to my mind when I'm looking at all these things, Well, did I say something subversive? Maybe I said something wrong. I'm trying to see. It's something explosive. Did I offend somebody by saying this? Huh?
No, the thing that the idea that I see moving the dominant cultural left of America and the West in general is one that has a desire to have a universalist mission, to baptize all nations. Again, you have to use these languages because I see Marxism and all these different ideologies as basically Christian heresies. They're Christian deviations, Christian mutations.
That's how they emerged originally. They were, in fact, we didn't mention it, but originally they were offshoots of Christian sects, like Robert Owen, who was one of the first spearheads of socialism. It's another, again, get my book, and the first chapter explains how gradually out of Protestant sects, we have these secularized sects emerging.
Right.
And Great Awakening.
And what happens is you've got this this universalist call to again subdue all nations through force, though, which Jesus would say, no, everything has to be through free agency. There is no, because he says, do not resist evil with violence. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. And everything about Jesus is nonviolent. He respects the volition, the free agency of the people he's engaging. He does not initiate violence and coercion to accomplish heaven on earth. It's a free agency process. It's a nonviolence. It's allowing violence and evil to collapse on its own weight. And the Marxist impulse, or let's just say the cultural left universalist impulse, is one in which it doesn't have time for that. It wants to force the kingdom of heaven by force because, allowing oppressive structures to fall apart on their own weight.
David, to some extent, it happens naturally. So when you replace God with this human action, with the state, so that's how you have this, right. Because you need some kind of force that comes to replace God, okay?
Right.
Ultimately, listening to you, but still I want to have my own take on this. Ultimately, it's in our hands, how we're up to us, which way we will go,
Right.
In our hands, it's, of course, religious people might say, so everything in the hands of God, but Marxists say everything in the hands of state. But I'm saying it depends on different forces. Sometimes it's like, see, that's what makes the world scary and beautiful at the same time, because we cannot predict which way our world would develop. That is why people They want to explain the world, but the world cannot be explained because something happens suddenly. Who could predict that last year this so-called corona could happen? Okay, out of the blue, nobody could predict, and people responded in this kind of crazy way. There's no way to get out of this right now because we became prisoners.
But if you look at history, sacrificial violence always emerges in a plague. So it is predictable.
Yes, that's true. By the way, because that's the plague we have right now, and that's how violence, because it simultaneously happens, right?
Plagues unleash witch hunts because people want to know who caused this and who do we need to purge to stop this from
witches,
happening.
And the peasants, this ignorant peasants, in 1500s, the 1600s, they were doing this witch hunt. They said, "Oh my God, Catholics, plague happened, people died. Who did this? Somebody should be responsible because it's a natural. Unfortunately, that's the nature of our human minds to look for scapegoats.
Must pay.
Somebody has to pay. Or Catholics were killing Christians. See, on top of this plague, we have Reformation, religious wars. When in Europe, Catholics were killing Protestants, Protestants were killing Catholics. So ignorant peasants with one noodle in their head, they start, oh my God, it means the great Satan sent the witches and planted them among us. So let's identify them. This is the lady. She's a midwife. She's not married. She might be a witch, She is politically incorrect,
Right.
We need to burn her, because we need to, we need to cancel her. Cancel her on the fire. By fire.
They accused the Jews of poisoning the water.
Jews,
or something.
That was one of the most widespread accusations at that time, that Jews poisoned the wells. That's how they literally were mobs of people who attacked the Jewish settlements. It was a horrible tragedy. It in fact provoked the whole population movement of Jews. I looked into this issue. Jews were escaping from Central Western Europe, to Eastern Europe at that time. Okay, that's what happened.
See, what my theory, and I want to close with your final thoughts after, which is, my theory is, going back to anthropology, when I look at René Girard and his work, he basically suggests that, religion is what births humanity itself. Religion is the placenta of humanity, and that religion is where we get culture and the state eventually, and governments and ideologies. So all of these ideologies are vestiges of sacred religion, of ritual. And he would say that all of religion, and again, it's just a passing glance at his idea here, but all of his all of these different religions are ultimately rooted in what you just described, the scapegoat hunt, the scapegoat mechanism, which is in times of crisis, when you have unleashed undifferentiation, which people lose their sense of self, they become mad, angry, suspicious, envious in a reciprocal way, and it spirals out into all against all. You need to be able to purge that bad blood, that bad energy onto a common enemy. And that's the scapegoat. And it's in the expelling of the scapegoat that the community is able to be bound together by the mutual consumption or purging of a common enemy. And that's the foundation of the state today and all of the ideological forms of it. And so what I'm seeing today, Girard says that Christianity comes in and destroys the scapegoat mechanism by allowing Jesus to basically perform the role of the scapegoat. But this time the text says that the scapegoat is innocent rather than guilty of the charges of the community. And that story is what's undermining the logic of the state all over the world, wherever that story spreads. So for me, when I see all of these different fraying apart of Western institutions, it's exactly what we would expect, because when people can't agree on who to scapegoat anymore, they don't know how to be bound together. You know what I mean? If you used to be able to, you burn the witch and everybody says, okay, we did it. We solved the problem, and we write it in our story that we're all together. Or we kill the old king who's tyrannical and we're bound together. Or we kill the heretic or whatever it is. But now we don't know who to blame. Is it that, for the coronavirus, is it the Chinese like Trump said, or is it Or is it people who don't wear 16 masks? Now you're supposed to be just one mask. Now it's 5, 6, 7 masks on top. Those are the people spreading it, so we don't know who to blame. And therefore we don't know how to discharge our resentment and unify. And that's where we're at today. That's why, we're haunted by victims like the cultural left, but we don't know who to call as the true oppressor and who's the true victim, do we?
Yeah, in fact, it goes both on the left and on the right. Again, before I say my final words, I want to say, like, as a kind of in a joking way, I guess Japanese already had invented something which they used, like to show a way out. Remember, in 1970s, 80s, Japanese capitalists came up with this idea to manufacture their own effigies, to be beaten, to be destroyed, to be burned, to kind of to give release to people, to like a scapegoat, a surrogate scapegoat. But to be serious, my final thought would be how to find there should be a way out of this conundrum, right? A natural question. How are we going to get out of this conundrum? Mm-hmm. And that's, I guess that's when our internal humility should come. Because when people exercise humility, when they don't blame the world for all the troubles, when they try to look in themselves, that might be, I wouldn't say that would help to explain everything, but at least it would allow to release this tension, this toxic environment which we have to deal with right now, And unfortunately, I see that people either don't have desire or don't have power sometimes, to do it, So for myself, I try to look at myself. What am I doing in this world? Maybe I did not respond to kind of particular needs of people in the way. Maybe I didn't try to understand them. I know it sounds a very kind of masochistic, pacifistic, but there is no other way out of this conundrum. You could be an agnostic, an atheist, or religious person, but unless you exercise this self-reflection, self-criticism, humility, there's no way out to get out of this.
Wow, it's a very well put, and that reminds me of what Jerry Boyer, a friend of mine, says about the story where Jesus says, "Take out the plank in your own eye so you can see your brother's speck." Right, the speck. You're obsessed with the speck in your brother's eye, but you've got a plank in your eye. But it's if you're unable to address your own problem first, you can't even see clearly the problem of your brother or
it's
your
good
neighbor.
Quote, good quotation.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been what a great discussion, and I think folks are going to listen to this a couple times just to digest all of the great information that you've provided for us today. A whirlwind little tour of history as it pertains to our encounter with these ideas of socialism. And I want to recommend our guest, Professor Andrei Znamenski. Check out his book, Socialism as a Secular Creed, where you can do more deep dive into this subject matter. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me here, and I hope to see you again.
Very good. Always, it was a pleasure. Thank you.